Between March 1852 and October 1853, 7 young men from Boston's most powerful families died in what the coroner dismissed as a series of tragic accidents. What no one in authority admitted, or perhaps dared to admit, was that every one of these men had signed a strange contract with Margaret Lawrence, the wealthiest widow on Beacon Hill, exactly 9 months before their deaths. Each agreement promised them $3,000 in exchange for services society would never name aloud. When Dr. Samuel Whitt opened his practice near the Lawrence mansion, he began noticing what others had ignored. Behind the polished doors of Boston's elite lay a disturbing pattern that pointed straight to the Lawrence family. What he uncovered within those iron gates would test his faith in humanity and force him to choose between protecting his medical career or following his conscience. The Lawrence mansion itself told a story of wealth and power. Built in 1798 by Josiah Lawrence, a shipping magnate who prospered during the Napoleonic Wars, it stood like a fortress of privilege on Mount Vernon Street, its red brick walls towering above granite foundations and guarded by iron fencing. His grandson Thomas had multiplied the family fortune through textiles, lifting them from wealthy to untouchable. But when Thomas died suddenly in 1851, after tumbling down his own grand staircase during a party crowded with judges and politicians, whispers began to circle. The coroner called it an accident, noting his drinking. But some guests left that night uneasy. His widow Margaret wore black as expected, yet those close to her sensed something unsettling. At 43, she carried herself not with sorrow, but with a kind of cold determination, as if freed to pursue a purpose long kept in the shadows. Margaret had come to Boston decades earlier from Prussia, daughter of a Harvard professor, her sharp gray eyes and slight accent setting her apart in Beacon Hill society. Now she commanded one of the most imposing homes in the city, raising 3 daughters in the very heart of Boston's elite quarter, where cobblestone streets and gas-lit lamps reflected fortunes built on shipping textiles and banking. Into this world stepped Dr. Whitt, just 27, freshly trained at Harvard, idealistic and ambitious. He set up his practice on Charles Street in 1852, believing Beacon Hill would give him both patience and prestige. But soon what began as routine visits would lead him into a chilling discovery, one that revealed how money, power, and silence could bury the darkest truths for generations. Samuel Whitt's own family background was respectable, but hardly elite. His father had taught school in Salem, and Samuel had earned his way through Harvard Medical School by tutoring wealthier classmates. Starting his practice on Beacon Hill was not easy. Most families there had relied on the same physicians for generations, men whose discretion and loyalty were as much a part of their service as their medical skill. At first, Samuel's patients were modest folk merchants, clerks, and above all, household servants. But his youth energy and willingness to answer calls at any hour gradually brought him into homes that others never entered. It was through these servants that Samuel first heard unsettling whispers about the Lawrence estate. In May of 1852, a young maid named Bridget O'Sullivan came to him feverish and weak. As he prepared her medicine, she casually remarked that Mrs. Lawrence was hiring more staff, particularly young women, to live and work in a secluded wing of the mansion. When Samuel asked if the household was unusually large, Bridget gave a curious reply. "Larger than you might think, doctor," she said with a tone that suggested something unsaid. She added that many rooms were occupied, though few outside the family ever saw who lived there. Then she quickly shifted the conversation back to her illness. The remark stayed with Samuel. The Lawrence daughters themselves had nearly vanished from public view after their father's funeral. Once they had appeared at church social gatherings and receptions like any well-bred young women of their class. Now they were rarely seen at all. When Samuel occasionally glimpsed them through the tall windows of the mansion, their pale faces and drifting movements reminded him less of healthy young women than of restless spirits. In Boston of the 1850s, every detail of a family's conduct mattered. Young women of wealth were expected to marry produce heirs and uphold their family's standing. That all three Lawrence daughters had reached their 20s unmarried was unusual but tolerated under the excuse of mourning. Still, that excuse could not last forever. Boston fortunes were not as secure as they seemed. The textile industry faced new competition from Lowell and Lawrence, and unrest over slavery threatened the cotton trade. Even for the wealthiest families, careful planning was required to maintain power. Margaret Lawrence's planning, however, did not resemble that of her neighbors. She had been raised with different influences. Her father in Prussia had moved among scholars who studied heredity, natural philosophy, and early theories of selective breeding. Where Boston's elite saw pride in old family names, Margaret saw an opportunity to create something greater. She believed humanity itself could be improved, that superior men and women could be paired to produce children stronger, brighter, and more capable than the generation before. Her late husband had dismissed such notions as dangerous nonsense, unfit for polite society. But Thomas Lawrence was gone, and Margaret was now free to test the theories she had long harbored. She understood her family's wealth might not last forever. But if she could produce a new generation, bred not just for privilege, but for inherent excellence, then the Lawrence legacy would be untouchable. She envisioned a new aristocracy, one grounded in blood and biology rather than fortune alone. To begin, she needed to choose the right fathers. She studied genealogies of Boston's oldest families, tracing their lines back through centuries, searching for signs of health, intelligence, and strength. With the guidance of a German physician, her father had known Dr. Hofmeister, she compiled lists of young men who carried what he called desirable traits. His advice was chillingly clear. Avoid weak blood. Select only those with proven family histories of vigor and keep records of every outcome. Margaret Lawrence was not simply preserving her fortune. She was attempting to reshape human destiny, starting within the brick walls of her own Beacon Hill mansion. Margaret Lawrence never intended for the young men she recruited to become lasting parts of her household. To her, they were tools, temporary instruments, whose only purpose was to provide the raw material for what she envisioned as a new lineage. The children born of these arrangements would be hers to mold, raised according to her principles, shaped into what she believed would be a superior generation. The fathers, once their roles were fulfilled, were disposable. The first of these men was Jonathan Lell, 24 years old, the third son of a textile dynasty whose family mills employed hundreds. He received a handwritten note one damp March afternoon in 1852, delivered by a well-dressed servant. The message was brief and enticing, a discreet business opportunity with extraordinary compensation. Curious, and perhaps desperate to escape the shadow of his elder brothers, Jonathan agreed to meet. He was ushered into a lavish French-style parlor on Mount Vernon Street, where pastoral wallpaper framed heavy velvet furniture. Margaret Lawrence greeted him herself, without chaperone, a breach of etiquette that set the tone for what followed. Offering him brandy, she wasted no time in outlining her proposition. She spoke with the icy precision of someone who had rehearsed every word. "I have 3 daughters," she told him, her Prussian accent sharpening her tone. "I do not intend to marry them as society expects. I intend something different. I require men of excellent breeding to spend time with my daughters for a very specific purpose, under contract, and with complete discretion." Jonathan had blinked, unsure if he was hearing a scandalous invitation or some bizarre financial scheme. Margaret pressed on, explaining with unnerving calm that she was conducting an experiment. She had studied her daughter's bloodlines and his own family's genealogy in detail. She cited his grandfather's long life, his father's academic brilliance, and his mother's unbroken line free of madness or disease. To her, Jonathan represented prime breeding stock. "You speak of people as if we were cattle," Jonathan said, his face reddening. "I speak of reality," Margaret replied coolly. "Farmers understand breeding. Why should humans be different? My daughters will bear children. The question is whether those children will be accidents of chance or the result of careful design." She then produced a formal contract. Written in the language of business, it offered him $3,000, an immense sum far beyond what most men earned in years, in exchange for services not to exceed 3 months. He would attend the mansion twice a week, be granted access to one of her daughters, and swear absolute secrecy. Breaking the agreement would mean forfeiture of payment and legal consequences. Jonathan hesitated. He called it immoral, but his voice wavered. The truth was that $3,000 could change his life, free him from dependence on his family's unstable fortunes. Margaret countered his weak protest with chilling logic. Society already treated marriage as a transaction of beauty and dowries for wealth and alliances. She was only stripping away the pretense and applying science. That night, Jonathan signed the contract with a trembling hand. Margaret assigned him to Catherine, her eldest daughter, and laid out a precise schedule, Tuesdays and Fridays from 7 to 10 in a third-floor room prepared for the arrangement. When Jonathan first climbed those stairs, his heart hammered in his chest. Catherine awaited him in silence, clad in a white nightgown, her face pale and expressionless, like a marble figure brought to life. She never spoke, never met his gaze. For Jonathan, it was not passion, not even companionship. It was duty ritual, and something far colder, the first step in Margaret Lawrence's chilling vision. From the beginning, Jonathan Lell understood that Catherine was no willing partner, but another prisoner of her mother's scheme. At first he thought her silence meant she was slow or simple, but he soon realized it was something worse. Catherine spoke rarely, her words careful and restrained, as though she had been trained never to reveal a thought of her own. She never smiled, never showed defiance, never questioned. At 22, she was less a daughter than a vessel molded into a living instrument of Margaret Lawrence's ambitions. By June, Catherine's pregnancy had been quietly confirmed by a discreet physician from South Boston, a man who catered to those who could pay for his silence. Jonathan's required visits ceased, and Margaret summoned him to the parlor for one final meeting. She praised him in her cold, businesslike way, assured him the rest of his payment would follow once the child was born, and reminded him that absolute silence was not just expected, but enforced. Jonathan accepted the gold coins she offered, but the weight of them burned in his pocket. He tried to convince himself that he had done nothing monstrous. Catherine would have been married, would have had children regardless. Yet the memory of her lifeless eyes haunted him. He began drinking heavily, seeking relief in waterfront taverns where no one asked questions. But liquor could not wash away the shame. One rainy night in October, Jonathan stumbled from a dockside tavern and into the path of a freight wagon hauling barrels of whale oil. Witnesses claimed he was drunk, but others noted that the wagon belonged to a company tied to the Lawrence interests. His skull was crushed beneath the wheels. The coroner, as usual, declared it a tragic accident. Margaret Lawrence attended the funeral, discreet and solemn, sending a wreath of lilies and a polite note of condolence before returning home to prepare for the next candidate. The cycle repeated with chilling efficiency. William Elbridge, of a shipbuilding family, was paired with Elizabeth. He carried out his part, was paid, and died 3 months later in a fall from a building one owned by a trust connected to Margaret's lawyer. Then came Henry Cunningham, grandson of a Massachusetts governor, matched with the youngest daughter, Anne. At only 25, he was pronounced dead of sudden heart failure, his physician rewarded soon after with a generous donation. By the end of 1853, all 3 Lawrence daughters were pregnant. And 3 promising young men from Boston's oldest families were buried in the ground. Dr. Samuel Whitt had not intended to involve himself. His practice demanded his attention, and he knew better than to meddle in the tragedies of the wealthy. But in November, he was summoned to the Lawrence mansion when a servant girl collapsed in the kitchen. Escorted through the grand foyer by a stone-faced butler, Samuel passed polished mahogany tables, fresh-cut flowers, and silent hallways that reeked of restraint. Then he noticed something strange. The third-floor landing was blocked by a locked door. From behind it came muffled footsteps and the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. The butler caught his glance. "Mrs. Lawrence maintains a private ward for family members," he said with a stiffness that left no room for further questions. Yet Samuel left the house unsettled. The pattern of deaths, the pregnancies, the silence, it was no longer possible to dismiss what he had begun to suspect. Something terrible was unfolding within the red brick walls of the Lawrence estate. "It is not to be disturbed." That was all the butler had said when Samuel's eyes lingered on the locked third-floor landing, the place where he thought he heard footsteps and the faint cry of an infant. The warning echoed in his mind long after he left the Lawrence mansion. He had treated Mary Finnegan, the exhausted servant girl, and prescribed rest and better meals. But what unsettled him most was what happened on his way out. One of the Lawrence daughters appeared in the hallway, heavily pregnant, her belly straining against a loose dress. Her eyes were vacant, unfocused, as if she were sleepwalking through her own body. Samuel had greeted her Miss Lawrence without knowing if it was Catherine Elizabeth or Anne. She gave no response, only walked past him with slow, mechanical steps until the butler arrived and escorted him firmly to the door. "The young ladies are not receiving visitors, doctor," he said, his tone cold and final. That image haunted Samuel. There had been something profoundly wrong about the young woman. She had moved like a puppet pulled by invisible strings, alive in body, but hollow in spirit. He began to ask questions cautiously, piecing together fragments of rumor and gossip from the servants of Beacon Hill. The whispers were consistent. The Lawrence daughters had lived in near total confinement since their father's death. They never attended church, never received callers, never stepped beyond the estate walls. Their mother dictated every detail of their existence, from meals to clothing to the hours they slept. The pregnancies had not gone unnoticed by the household staff. Everyone knew, though no one dared speak of the fathers. What they did know was that strange young men sometimes arrived at the mansion after dark. They were always escorted upstairs, always gone within hours, never seen again. One maid whispered to Samuel that Mrs. Lawrence kept ledger's records of everything from body measurements to dates of visits, as though her daughters were not people, but test subjects in some grim scientific trial. Samuel resisted believing it, yet the evidence mounted. He began digging into Margaret Lawrence's background, uncovering her father's academic ties to European theories of heredity and selective breeding. Combined with the rumors, the truth began to take shape. The Lawrence daughters were not just under their mother's control. They were part of an experiment. Then Samuel looked at the deaths. 3 young men, all from prominent families, all dead within months of leaving the Lawrence home. On paper, they were accidents. But when Samuel used a favor to obtain copies of the death certificates, the reports told another story. Jonathan Lell, head crushed by a wagon. The coroner had noted bruises on his arms, marks consistent with someone restraining him. Yet that detail had been conveniently minimized. William Elbridge, death from a fall. Witnesses claimed he had been seen with 2 unidentified men shortly beforehand. They were never questioned. Henry Cunningham, heart failure at 25. The attending physician had quietly recorded needle marks on his arms, suggesting injections, but that observation was omitted from the official conclusion. 3 men, 3 convenient deaths, all with ties to the Lawrence mansion. Their families accepted the explanations with striking ease. Samuel suspected why silence purchased with influence, or worse, a willing refusal to see the truth. By the winter of 1853, there could be no doubt in his mind. This was murder, orchestrated by someone powerful enough to bend officials and coroner's reports to her will. Murder serving a purpose that reached far beyond simple malice. In December, Catherine Lawrence gave birth to a son. Margaret called in her usual physician, the shadowy figure from South Boston, who asked no questions. No birth announcement was made. The infant was strong with the Lell family's dark hair and square jaw. Margaret studied him clinically, measuring his head, testing his reflexes, noting every detail before recording her observations in the leather-bound ledgers she kept locked in her private study. This was not the joy of a grandmother welcoming new life. It was the gaze of a scientist marking the results of her first successful trial. The first child, Catherine's son, had passed Margaret's cold evaluation and was placed in the 3rd-floor nursery to be raised according to her strict principles. Elizabeth's daughter followed in January 1854, and Anne's son in February, both born healthy, both subjected to the same meticulous examinations, both recorded in Margaret's ledgers like specimens. The experiment was moving forward exactly as she had envisioned. But then came a complication. Margaret had not anticipated a 4th pregnancy. It was not one of her daughters, but a servant, a nursery maid named Sophia Prescott, who had drawn the interest of William Elbridge during his visits. Margaret had been furious at first. This was an unplanned variable, a deviation from her carefully designed project. Yet Sophia came from respectable colonial stock, her family tracing its roots back to Plymouth, and Margaret decided the child might serve as a useful comparison. Sophia gave birth to a daughter in March 1854. At first, the infant seemed healthy, but within 2 weeks, she developed a persistent cough. Margaret studied her, closely consulted her ledgers and letters from Hofmeister, and concluded that the baby carried a weakness in her lungs, a defect that marked her as unfit. On a cold April morning, Sophia woke to find her child's cradle empty. Her frantic search ended when Margaret met her in the hallway with an expression of icy contempt. "The child was defective," Margaret said. "She has been removed." Sophia screamed, begged, demanded to know where her daughter had gone. Margaret silenced her with threats. She would be paid $50 for her service, and if she ever spoke of what had happened, she would be declared insane and confined to an asylum. Broken and terrified, Sophia took the money and left the mansion that day. But silence was impossible. Desperate and grieving, she sought out the only person she thought might listen, Dr. Samuel Whitt. She arrived at his Charles Street office in hysterics, barely able to get the words out through sobs. Samuel listened, and the blood drained from his face as he realized the enormity of what she was telling him. Babies treated as livestock. Mothers discarded as irrelevant. A child vanished because she was deemed defective. "You must go to the police," Samuel urged. "They will not hear me. They'll not hear me," Sophia wept. "Mrs. Lawrence has wealth connections. I am no one. They will call me mad and lock me away." Samuel knew she was right. Margaret's influence reached far beyond her mansion walls. Any accusation without proof would destroy the accuser. But he could not turn away. "Let me investigate," he told her. "If I can find evidence, we will have something no one can ignore." He gave her money for a safe lodging and promised to return with answers. His chance came sooner than expected. In late April, a summons arrived from the Lawrence mansion. One of the daughters was gravely ill after childbirth. When Samuel arrived, the butler unlocked the forbidden 3rd floor with a heavy brass key and led him up a narrow staircase that reeked of milk and laudanum. The 3rd floor had been transformed into a private medical ward. Bedrooms lined a central corridor, each orderly and sterile, and at the far end stood a large nursery. Inside one chamber, Anne Lawrence lay fevered and delirious, her body ravaged by puerperal fever. Samuel treated her as best he could with quinine and cold compresses, though he knew her chances were slim. As he worked, he studied his surroundings carefully. The rooms looked less like family quarters and more like a laboratory. Shelves held medical texts and journals, and a desk by the window was crowded with ledgers, each page filled with neat rows of measurements, dates, and clinical observations. Margaret stood silently in the corner, her sharp gray eyes never leaving him. Samuel realized with a sickening certainty that he was standing in the heart of her experiment. An experiment that had already claimed lives, and that was only beginning. Margaret had shown no maternal instinct, no sign of concern for Anne's agony. She stood over her dying daughter as if she were an interesting case study rather than her own flesh and blood. She asked only detached, clinical questions, how high the fever had climbed, how likely survival was, and when Samuel warned her that the prognosis was poor, her response was chillingly practical. If she dies, she said, the child will require a wet nurse. Not a word of comfort, not a tear. Samuel had treated many cold, distant parents in his time, but never anything like this. As a physician, he was expected to maintain composure, but the way Margaret spoke like a farmer managing livestock left him shaken. When she briefly left the room to give instructions to a servant, Samuel moved to the desk near the window, where the ledgers lay open. He had hesitated for only a moment before scanning the pages. What he saw confirmed every dark suspicion. Margaret's records stretched back years, the names of the men she had selected, their family trees, their medical histories, even the longevity and cause of death of grandparents. She had logged every visit, every conception, every birth. On the facing pages, she had noted the traits she hoped to see emerge, physical features, mental potential, health indicators. But in the margins, written in neat cold script, were entries that made his blood freeze. JL disposal completed October 14th. No complications. We disposal completed November 3rd. Method effective. HC disposal completed December 9th. Injection method successful. Jonathan Lell. William Elbridge. Henry Cunningham. Margaret hadn't simply arranged their deaths, she had recorded them as if they were a routine part of her study. The culling of surplus or defective stock. Even more chilling were the sections about the children. They weren't given names, only designations. Subject A1, Catherine's son. Subject B1, Elizabeth's daughter. Subject C1, Anne's son. Subject D1, Sophia's daughter. Each entry listed Waite's head measurements, developmental milestones, and Margaret's clinical assessments. Under D1 there was a final note: persistent respiratory weakness, unsuitable for study, removed April 3rd, 1854. Samuel's hands shook as he closed the ledger. He had been right, Sophia's baby had not been stolen or given away. She had been eliminated. Margaret wasn't just engineering a new generation. She was erasing the ones who didn't meet her standards. Margaret returned before he could collect himself, her sharp gray eyes sweeping the room. Samuel resumed treating Anne, but his mind was racing. He now had direct evidence of murder, but acquiring it under the guise of a physician put him in an impossible position. To expose Margaret, he would have to admit he'd rifled through private papers, violating both his medical ethics and the law. Anne Lawrence died 3 days later. Margaret showed no visible grief at the funeral, only efficiency. She arranged for a wet nurse for Anne's infant son and returned to her ledgers, her experiment undisturbed. Samuel went back to his practice, but he could no longer pretend ignorance. Margaret Lawrence was systematically creating and culling human lives, using her daughters as breeding vessels and killing anyone who posed a threat to her work. The young men had been instruments discarded when they were no longer useful. The unsuitable infants, God only knew how many, had been erased entirely. He knew then he had to act. Yet he also knew the danger. Margaret had already silenced 3 men without consequence, and her influence stretched into the police, the coroner's office, the courts. If he accused her without unassailable proof, he might share their fate. What happened on the night of May 15th, 1854, changed everything. As Samuel crossed Boston Common after a difficult childbirth case in the North End, a figure waited for him under a flickering gas lamp, a silhouette that would draw him deeper into the nightmare he'd been trying to escape. The figure waiting beneath the flickering gas lamp was not a servant at all, but Catherine Lawrence, cloaked in plain clothing, with her face half hidden by a shawl. She approached Samuel cautiously, glancing over her shoulder, as if she feared eyes watching from the shadows. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and trembling, but laced with a desperate resolve. "Dr. Whit," she whispered, "I need your help. My mother is planning to kill me." Samuel froze. In the glow of the lamp, Catherine's features were sharper than he remembered, gaunt, pale, but no longer blank. Her eyes held an awareness he had never seen in her before, as if she had at last broken free from whatever spell her mother had cast. Why would she do that? Samuel asked, though in his gut he already knew the answer. "She has what she wanted," Catherine said. "My son is strong. He is everything she predicted. She has her records, her notes, her proof. I am no longer useful. Worse, I know too much. I overheard her with her attorney. They were planning for my unfortunate illness. She intends to poison me slowly and make it look like complications from childbirth." Catherine pulled a small vial from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. "She puts this in my tea every evening. Tonight I only pretended to drink it. Please, can you test it? Can you tell me what it is?" Samuel accepted the vial, his mind reeling. He had suspected Margaret capable of cruelty, even murder. But to hear her daughter confess that she was next, this was beyond what he had imagined. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Why not the police?" "Because you already suspect her," Catherine replied. "I've seen it in your eyes when you treat her servants. You know something is wrong, and you are not yet in her grasp. You're too young to have been bought. You are my only hope." Samuel promised to help, though he knew he was now placing himself squarely in Margaret's line of fire. He instructed Catherine to continue feigning obedience, drink only enough of the tea to keep suspicion away, while he searched for proof. The next morning, after careful chemical tests, Samuel confirmed what Catherine already knew. The vial contained arsenic diluted just enough to kill slowly. Taken over weeks, it would destroy her organs and appear natural in a woman already weakened by childbirth. Margaret was planning filicide disguised as fate. The vial was evidence, but Samuel knew it wasn't enough. Margaret's wealth and influence could sweep away one daughter's accusation. He needed proof so overwhelming that even her power could not bury it. He turned to Margaret's past, hoping to uncover the roots of her obsession. At Harvard, Samuel combed through archives, piecing together the hidden history of her father, Professor Klaus von Haussmann. Officially, von Haussmann had left his post in 1835 for vague disagreements with the administration. Unofficially, Samuel discovered the truth had been far darker. Among dusty letters in the university's sealed records, he found a note from the president to the board of overseers. Von Haussmann had been experimenting on living children, orphans and paupers taken from almshouses. He had measured their intelligence, their physical traits, their behavior, all in an attempt to prove that heredity could predict destiny. When whispers of these experiments surfaced, the university had moved swiftly to cover the scandal, paying off families and dismissing the professor quietly. He died soon after, but his papers, his blueprints for a perfected human, remained locked away. Samuel gained access by claiming he was researching hereditary disease. What he uncovered chilled him. Von Haussmann's writings seethed with pseudoscience about racial superiority. the elimination of inferior stock, and the moral duty of the strong to breed selectively. Letters between von Haussmann and other European academics revealed a network of like-minded thinkers, men who saw humanity not as souls, but as breeding stock. Among these papers, Samuel found something even more damning: letters from Margaret herself. Written between 1845 and 1850, they showed she had not only absorbed her father's theories, but refined them. She described her marriage to Thomas Lawrence as deliberate, chosen for his family's documented vigor and longevity. In her correspondence, she admitted she was preparing for the day when she could continue her father's work, this time not in secrecy but in her own household, using her daughters, her wealth, and the prestige of the Lawrence name. Samuel read the letters by the dim light of the archive and felt the truth settle like ice in his chest. Margaret Lawrence was not improvising. She was not a grieving widow gone mad. She was the inheritor of a dark legacy, carrying forward her father's obsession with human perfection. And now she was willing to murder even her own blood to protect it. Thomas Lawrence's death, long dismissed as a drunken misstep, was at last revealed for what it was: murder. In a letter dated November 1850, Margaret had written to her father with cold precision, "Thomas must be removed. He has discovered some of my preparations and threatens to have me confined for unnatural philosophies. He does not understand that we stand at the threshold of transformation. Once he is gone, I will have the freedom and resources to proceed. The experiment will be my legacy to your memory." Samuel had stared at those words, feeling the full weight of the revelation. Thomas had not been an unfortunate casualty of stares and brandy. He had been eliminated deliberately by a wife who saw him as an obstacle to science. Worse, she had not acted alone. Margaret had written of men of influence who shared her vision, who believed Boston's future lay in cultivating superior bloodlines. Their identities remained hidden, but Samuel understood he was no longer confronting a single widow with delusions of grandeur. He was facing a network of power. Knowing how fragile the evidence was, Samuel copied the most damning documents, working deep into the night at Harvard's archives. He understood that if Margaret suspected the originals could vanish as quickly as the men who had fathered her grandchildren. Yet even with the letters, he faced the question of how to act without condemning both himself and Catherine to certain death. The answer arrived unexpectedly. In June 1854, a man appeared at Samuel's practice, an older lawyer named Josiah Fletcher. His manner cautious, his words measured. "Dr. Whit, I represent the Lell family. I understand you've been making inquiries about the death of Jonathan Lell." Samuel braced for either a warning or a threat. Instead, Fletcher revealed that Jonathan's father had long harbored doubts. Jonathan had been terrified in his final weeks, drunk with guilt, muttering about something terrible he had done. He had come into an unexplained fortune of $3,000, but refused to disclose its source. Days before his death, he had confessed to his father that powerful people wanted him silenced. Then Fletcher produced a document from his case: Jonathan's contract with Margaret Lawrence. Carefully worded, cloaked in businesslike formality, it left no doubt Jonathan had been paid to father a child with Catherine. Samuel's hands shook as he examined it. For the first time, he held direct evidence, a legal agreement tying Margaret to the scheme, and by implication, to Jonathan's suspicious death. "Why bring this to me?" Samuel asked. "Because the Lell family cannot," Fletcher replied. "If it became known Jonathan participated even under pressure, the scandal would ruin us. But you, doctor, have cause. You've treated the Lawrence household. You've asked questions. If you bring charges, the Lell family will support you quietly. Witnesses will come forward. Influence will be applied. But you must strike fast before Margaret can move against you." Samuel saw the offer for what it was, an alliance. The Lell family's name and wealth, joined to his own expertise and evidence, could possibly outweigh Margaret's power. but he also saw the danger. If I move against her, she will try to kill me. Fletcher didn't flinch. Yes, which is why you must act decisively with evidence so strong even her friends cannot protect her. In the days that followed, they gathered the pieces. The contracts, Jonathan's, William Elbridge's, Henry Cunningham's. Margaret's letters to her father. Catherine's testimony about the poison. Sophia Prescott's story of her vanished child. Samuel's own observations from the forbidden third floor. Together they had enough to charge Margaret Lawrence with conspiracy, fraud, and murder. But the deeper they dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Fletcher noticed something odd in the official records of the men's deaths. All three had been certified by the same coroner, Virgil Danforth, who consistently ruled them accidental despite irregularities. Danforth's appointment, it turned out, had been secured through Judge Harrison Apprentice, the very man who had been present when Thomas Lawrence fell to his death. Further investigation revealed that Apprentice was not merely a corrupt official, but a member of a private organization calling itself the Society for Human Advancement. Founded in 1848, the Society counted among its ranks prominent Bostonians, judges, legislators, a newspaper publisher, even the mayor's chief legal advisor. And their guiding philosophy, the very theories Klaus von Haussmann had preached. Samuel realized then that Margaret Lawrence was not a lone widow conducting a grotesque family experiment. She was part of a wider conspiracy, a society of powerful men and women who saw Boston as fertile ground for breeding a new aristocracy and improved humanity. And they would kill without hesitation to protect their vision. Margaret Lawrence had been under no illusion that she acted alone. Since Thomas's death, she had been corresponding with members of the Society for Human Advancement, the same secretive circle of judges, legislators, and intellectuals who had once dined at her table. To them, Margaret's home had become a living laboratory, a place where their abstract theories about improving humanity were put to the test on living flesh. In exchange for her results, they had shielded her with their positions, smothering investigations, altering coroner's reports, and quietly removing threats. What Samuel and Fletcher had believed was the monstrous obsession of a single widow was in fact a conspiracy sustained by Boston's most powerful men. They believed they were midwives to the future, and Margaret their instrument. By the summer of 1854, Samuel understood that documents and testimony were not enough. Margaret's allies would dismiss written evidence as fabrication, discredit witnesses, and bury anything inconvenient beneath a mountain of influence. He needed something physical, something so undeniable it could not be suppressed. That meant returning to the third floor of the Lawrence mansion, this time not as a physician, but as an investigator. The chance arrived in late June. Elizabeth Lawrence, racked with severe abdominal pain, had summoned him. Samuel diagnosed a prolapsed uterus, serious but not immediately fatal, and recommended ongoing care over several days. Margaret agreed. It was the opening he had been waiting for. On his third visit, while Margaret was occupied downstairs, Samuel excused the attending nurse to fetch fresh linens and moved swiftly down the corridor, testing door handles. At the far end of the hall, past the nursery where the surviving children were kept, he found a locked door. Using a medical probe, a trick he had learned from a locksmith patient, grateful for his help, he coaxed the lock open and slipped inside. The room beyond was no nursery. It was a laboratory. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with glass jars of preserved specimens. Tiny organs suspended in cloudy alcohol tissue samples labeled with dates. Things Samuel could not bear to look at for more than a second. A central table held Margaret's complete records ledgers, more exhaustive than anything he had glimpsed before. Here were not only the notes on Catherine's, Elizabeth's, and Anne's children, but 7 previous subjects from the past 2 years, preliminary trials no one had known existed. Before contracting Jonathan Lell and the others, Margaret had experimented on servants and hired women selecting men for them, taking their babies after birth. Of the 7 infants, only 2 had met her standards. The rest, 5 human lives, were coldly marked unsuitable and removed. Subject E1 developmental delay at 6 months. Subject F1 whooping cough, constitutionally weak. Subject G1 unfortunate facial asymmetry, evidence of inferior bloodline. Samuel's stomach turned as he read on. The jars confirmed what the ledgers hinted. Margaret had not merely removed the unsuitable children, she had killed them and dissected their bodies. She had been trying to identify early physical markers of inferiority to refine her selection process. Babies were suffocated, their tiny organs studied like specimens from a farmyard. She had treated living infants as experimental material, stripped of dignity, stripped of humanity. Samuel had photographed page after page with the small camera he had borrowed, a new technology awkward but invaluable when he heard footsteps in the hall. He quickly closed the ledgers, pocketed the photographic plates, and turned to the jars, trying to appear as though he were inspecting them as a physician. The door opened. Margaret stood there, her face serene as if she had been expecting him. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said calmly. "You've been asking too many questions, Dr. Whit, Harvard lawyers, my servants. I have been watching you." Samuel's hand slid toward his medical bag, where Fletcher had insisted he keep a small pistol. But Margaret smiled a cold, humorless smile that never touched her eyes. "There is no need for violence, Doctor. We are civilized people. We can discuss this rationally. You have murdered children?" Samuel said, his voice trembling with fury. "You've killed the fathers of your grandchildren. You've poisoned your own daughter. There is nothing rational about what you've done." "On the contrary," Margaret replied, stepping inside and shutting the door behind her. "What I have done is entirely rational. Every farmer culls inferior livestock. Every gardener prunes weak seedlings. Why should humans be exempt from natural law? The children I removed would have lived unremarkable lives, contributing nothing of value. The men I eliminated had served their purpose and become liabilities. These were rational decisions made in service of a greater goal. And what goal could justify murdering children? Samuel demanded. "The creation of a superior human line." Margaret said, her voice ringing with conviction. "In 3 generations, my descendants will be healthier, more intelligent, more capable than any ordinary humans. They will be the foundation of a new aristocracy, not of wealth, but of blood. They will lead this nation into an age of unprecedented achievement. Can you not see the magnificence of this vision?" Samuel stared at her, realizing at last that he was not confronting a criminal to be arrested, but a fanatic, cloaked in science, a woman who believed herself history's architect. And he standing there in her private laboratory might be the last person who could stop her. Samuel swung the bag, the metal clink, and Catherine's cry filling the tiny lab for a heartbeat. Then he sprinted into the corridor and did not look back, feet thudding on the stairs as Margaret's composed voice echoed with calm fury behind him, and the dull sound of porcelain breaking where she had knocked a jar from a shelf. In frustration, he burst into the street and kept running until the gas lamps blurred into streaks of light, his lungs burning and his mind a single urgent task. Get the plates and the ledgers to Fletcher and get Catherine and Sophia to safety. He reached Fletcher's office, soaked with sweat and almost breathless. Fletcher closed his shutters, examined the photographic plates and the stolen ledger pages by candlelight, and then moved with a speed and cold precision that surprised Samuel, calling in discreet favors and arranging safe houses, while the Lell family quietly agreed to bankroll whatever legal and political pressure would be needed. They could not go to the public first because Margaret's allies controlled coroners and courts. So Fletcher planned to cut the ground from under them by securing a search warrant based on the physical evidence Samuel provided, and by lining up witnesses whose testimony could be corroborated by the photographs and the ledgers. In the days that followed, Samuel ferried Catherine and Sophia to a remote cottage where a midwife kept watch. He visited the police only long enough to hand over duplicates of the plates to a single trustworthy sergeant who owed Fletcher a debt. And together, they drafted a sealed affidavit to present to a judge sympathetic to Fletcher's cause. The warrant was granted under the cover of night. A small squad of officers, with Fletcher's Samuel and two cautious representatives of the Lell family, slipped up Mount Vernon Street while a rented carriage idled 2 blocks away. They forced the mansion door with battering irons, found the 3rd-floor door unlocked for the first time in months. Because Margaret, who never expected anyone to act so brazenly, had spent the afternoon preparing to flee inside the nursery. The officers uncovered jars and ledgers and blankets folded over small shapes that were not blankets at all. The surviving infants were thin but alive. The ghastly preservation jars and the leather-bound volumes provided the undeniable proof Fletcher had predicted Margaret, who had been packing a travel cloak and papers in the back parlor, walked into the house to find it transformed by torches and voices and officers. She did not panic. Outwardly, she lifted her chin and announced that she had acted for the good of posterity, that history would vindicate her. But the sight of the ledgers, now in official hands, and the plates reproduced into dozens of copies, silenced the polite members of the household who had been dragged from their rooms. The Society for Human Advancement tried to move. Emissaries called judges and editors. Threats were whispered and money offered. A few men attempted to buy silence. Others froze when confronted with the physical evidence and the sudden undeniable testimony of servants and mothers. Some members of the society fled the city to foreign ports. Others who had helped falsify coroner's reports found themselves quietly removed from office as investigations reopened the public trial that followed. Ripped open Beacon Hill's polished surface, the newspapers that had long adored the social elite now printed ledger excerpts and plate reproductions that made readers sick. Margaret was arraigned, and her calm gave way to moments of unmasked fury. And then a strange, brittle composure as prosecutors read aloud entries that cataloged infant deaths and coded references to disposal methods. Samuel testified. Fletcher produced contracts and correspondence linking Margaret to the society. Sophia and other servants told what they had seen. Catherine's testimony was complicated by the years of indoctrination she had endured and by the conflicted feelings that had made her both victim and participant. She spoke with a voice that sometimes wavered and sometimes hardened. And in the end, the jury found Margaret guilty. Some society members faced indictments, while others escaped conviction by the slimmest of margins. The city demanded reforms, and a few officials lost their posts. The surviving infants were put into the care of families willing to raise them openly, though the scandal scarred every life. It touched. Samuel returned to his practice a different man, haunted but vindicated, aware that the conviction did not erase the dead or the moral stain left on Boston's elite, and he understood that some powers had been weakened but not destroyed. There were whispers that the society would regather in secrecy elsewhere, and that other experiments might be attempted under new names. The case closed many doors, but left others only slightly ajar. And Samuel, who had promised Catherine he would protect her, kept watch for years, knowing that justice had been served in one courtroom, but that vigilance would be required if history did not want to repeat itself. Behind him, Margaret shouted for the servants, her voice sharp with command, and heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs as the butler and 2 other men gave chase, all bigger and stronger than Samuel. He bolted for the main stair but found it blocked and spun down the narrow back stairs toward the kitchen, Catherine screaming that he had stolen documents and must not escape. The kitchen burst into chaos when Samuel yelled that the 3rd floor was on fire, made screaming and running for the exits, and just the panic he needed to slow his pursuers. He plunged through the back garden, vaulting the 8-foot iron fence after flinging his medical bag over, only to feel a hand grab his ankle. He kicked free, landed on the sidewalk with a torn coat and a gashed arm, and ran until he forced himself to slow. No one in Boston helped a stranger, and he knew the city police could already be compromised. So he limped to Fletcher's law office, where the lawyer saw his condition and, after hearing the story, moved with ruthless efficiency. Fletcher bandaged him closed shutters, arranged safe houses, and said they needed protection beyond the city. So they hired a coach for Roxbury and sought out Captain Reginald Barnes of the state police, a square-jawed man who had grown tired of Beacon Hill corruption. Barnes listened, asked sharp questions, and when Samuel swore he had seen preserved infant bodies and had photographed ledgers that cataloged murders, Barnes agreed to act, but warned that a local raid would be stonewalled by Judge Apprentice and his allies. Fletcher argued they must go higher and involve the governor, and Barnes weighing the risk, and the evidence nodded that they should proceed with great caution and speed because the clock was already ticking, and Margaret would use every connection she had to strike first. Governor Clifford's involvement marked a turning point, but the fire at the Lawrence mansion nearly undid everything. Samuel Fletcher and Captain Barnes arrived prepared with ledgers, contracts, testimony, and photographic plates, only to learn the estate had gone up in flames. The timing was too perfect, the destruction too complete. Margaret had not only eliminated physical evidence, but if the messenger's uneasy admission was true, had also slipped away under the cover of night. The discovery that not all the bodies were recovered, and that a carriage had been seen leaving hours before the blaze, reframed the situation. Margaret had staged her own annihilation, sacrificing servants and perhaps even loyal household members to cover her escape. The Bremen Star's departure at dawn confirmed that Margaret had fled under her maiden name von Haussmann, with her daughters and the surviving children bound for Hamburg. She was not defeated, merely transplanted back into Europe, where her father's old academic network might shelter her. Governor Clifford's response reflected both outrage and caution. He recognized the potential scandal judges, legislators, even the mayor's advisor implicated in shielding a woman who bred and culled human beings like livestock. But rather than pursue the moral horror, Clifford focused on the political fallout. He agreed to sanction a full investigation, though carefully framed, to protect Massachusetts institutions. The guilty would face prosecution, but the government itself would remain untarnished. The trials that followed tore into the Society for Human Advancement. Coroner Danforth, cornered by evidence, turned informant, exposing how deaths had been falsified and investigations suppressed. Servants and witnesses spoke of late-night meetings, coded letters, and quiet payments. Judge Apprentice fought fiercely, filing motion after motion. But letters in his own hand tied him to Margaret's work, and when other society members turned state's evidence, his position collapsed. In October 1854, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Boston reeled from the scandal. The newspapers printed lurid details of preserved infants' secret contracts and experiments in the heart of Beacon Hill. Some details were suppressed to protect respectable families, but enough emerged to shatter the city's illusions of moral superiority. The Lawrence mansion stood only as a smoldering ruin, yet its shadow lingered, an emblem of wealth and power twisted into fanaticism. Samuel returned to his practice changed forever. He had fought not just one woman, but an entire conspiracy exposing rot at the very heart of Boston society. Margaret herself had slipped away, her name erased from the city's official record as though she had never existed. But Samuel could never forget. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Margaret Lawrence, or von Haussmann, still lived. Still plotting, still raising children born of her grotesque experiment. Treating the sick and the poor of Boston, the one society overlooked. Samuel threw himself into medicine with a new kind of purpose. He could not uproot Margaret Lawrence from the shadows she had melted into, nor could he stop the ideas she embodied from spreading through circles of wealth and ambition in Europe and beyond. But he could push back in the only way he knew, by healing, by caring, by refusing to treat people as mere material for experiments. The scandal of the Lawrence case eventually faded into Boston's past, remembered in whispers and footnotes, a cautionary tale of power and corruption. The ruined mansion was replaced by a respectable new residence. The families involved rebuilt their reputations, and the city's elites worked hard to scrub away the stain of what had been uncovered. Yet Beacon Hill never fully forgot. Old servants told hushed stories to new ones, and parents pulled their children close when walking past the site, as though something malignant still clung to the soil. For Samuel, the memory never dimmed. He remained haunted not only by the faces of the infants preserved in jars, but also by the letter Margaret had sent from Hamburg, and the chilling confirmation from Dr. Hartman that her work had continued abroad. He often wondered if she had slipped back into America under another name, resuming her experiments in some hidden corner of the country, far from Boston's watchful eyes. The children who had survived Catherine's son, Elizabeth's daughter, Anne's boy, grew up quietly in their father's families, their origins buried with deliberate care. Perhaps they lived long, respectable lives, never knowing the truth of their conception or the shadow their grandmother had cast over them. But Samuel knew, and he could never escape the question of whether those children born of coercion and conspiracy carried forward Margaret's vision in ways they themselves could not understand. By the 1860s, Samuel was regarded as a reformer physician, outspoken about the need for oversight in medicine and law. He advocated tirelessly for stronger safeguards against corruption, for protections of the vulnerable, and for reforms in how the poor were treated in hospitals. Some praised him as a moral light. Others sneered that he was a man who had ruined Boston's reputation by dragging skeletons from Beacon Hill's closets. In his private moments, Samuel sometimes felt both judgments were true. He had dragged the truth into daylight, but the cost had been staggering, and the architect of it all had escaped. Margaret Lawrence, Margaret von Haussmann, remained at large, of a phantom, moving through history, continuing her grotesque pursuit of human perfection. And so the story closed, not with triumph, but with unease. Boston had survived the scandal, but the world had not been rid of Margaret Lawrence. She had merely shifted her stage. Samuel Whitt lived out his days knowing he had saved lives. Yes, but also knowing he had failed to destroy the monster at the heart of it all. Somewhere, perhaps even within his own country again, Margaret's dark experiment might still be unfolding her legacy, lurking like a disease that refused to die. Samuel Whitt spent the rest of his life in Boston as a physician who placed compassion above ambition. He trained young doctors to remember that patients were not specimens, that science without humanity leads only to cruelty. He spoke out against the eugenic theories that were beginning to creep into universities and salons, warning that the same ideas which had driven Margaret Lawrence were spreading cloaked in more sophisticated language. In 1870, he published The Beacon Hill Tragedy, a physician's account of murder and pseudoscience. It was controversial. Some hailed it as courageous, others dismissed it as sensational. But it achieved his goal. The story could not be buried. Samuel forced future generations to confront the same questions that had haunted him. How do we balance discovery with dignity? How do we stop the powerful from reducing human beings to instruments of their ambition? He never married. His life was devoted to patience and reform until his death in 1889 at the age of 64. Hundreds came to his funeral, many of them ordinary people he had healed. The eulogy remembered him not for wealth or prestige, but as a man who had sacrificed comfort to stand for what was right. Margaret Lawrence, meanwhile, was never found. Some historians claim she died in obscurity in Europe. Others whisper she may have returned to America under another name, continuing her work in silence. No proof has ever emerged. Her 3 grandchildren grew up unaware of the shadow that had shaped their lives. One became a banker, another a minister's wife, the third a teacher. None of them displayed the engineered superiority Margaret had promised. But neither were they marked by weakness. They lived as ordinary people shaped more by love, opportunity, and choice than by the cold science their grandmother had forced upon them. The Society for Human Advancement dissolved after the trials, but the ideas lived on. By the turn of the century, eugenic theories once whispered in Margaret's study were fueling sterilization laws, immigration restrictions, and eventually, some of the greatest atrocities of the modern age. Margaret Lawrence had been a pioneer of these ideas in America. Stopping her in Boston did not stop history from repeating her mistakes elsewhere. The Lawrence mansion is long gone. A private home now stands where it once loomed over Mount Vernon Street. By the 20th century, few Bostonians remembered what had happened there. The scandal reduced to a footnote in dusty local histories. Yet the questions Margaret Lawrence raised never truly vanished. Who decides what lives are valuable? How far will humanity go in the name of progress? The greatest horrors are rarely supernatural. They come from human beings who believe their brilliance gives them the right to play God. That was the true darkness on Beacon Hill. So what do you think? Did Margaret Lawrence truly escape justice, or did her crimes eventually catch up with her? Leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, share it with a friend who loves dark history. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next tale, because the past has many more secrets waiting to be uncovered.